Hello. Deathwing is the first book of fiction ever published by Games Workshop for the 40k setting, featuring 7 stories written by authors like Bryan Ansell, William King, Storm Constantine, Charles Stross, and the legend of early Warhammer 40,000 fiction, Ian Watson. This is the GW Books Club, where my friend Stu and I are reading and talking about all of the earliest novels and short story collections published by Games Workshop for Warhammer Fantasy, Dark Future, and Warhammer 40,000. This book is the first of the 40k ones, and we're super excited to get into it. But before we start our discussions about each story in turn, I'm going to provide a very brief overview of what happens in it, starting with the first one in the collection, which is called Deathwing. Deathwing by Bryan Ansell and William King. Terminators of the Dark Angel chapter return to their homeworld on a recruitment mission, but they discover that all is not as it once was. As many as 100 years have passed since these warriors left the tribes of their ancestors, but now they discover that the tribesfolk they left behind have become enslaved and oppressed by the insidious machinations of a Genestealer cult. Whilst the chapter librarian infiltrates the cult city and destroys its patriarch, his battle brothers must decide what course of action best serves the Emperor. Should they destroy the planet outright, or fight to reclaim it and their people? Stu, we are going to be talking about all of the stories in this Deathwing anthology, the first anthology of 40k fiction, but the first story we're going to be talking about is also called Deathwing, and this one was by Bryan Ansell and William King, and it's all about Terminators, right? What was your initial feeling about this one?
I like it. It made me think, this is the launch story for Space Hulk, isn't it? And it's clearly what it was designed for.
Mm-hmm.
And it does that very well. It gives you all the necessary background that you need to know, depending on what for both sides in that conflict, in that game. And I think it does it quite well. It's very much obvious here, and it reminds me, there was a lot more of me remembering being 13, 14 and thinking, oh yeah, Dark Angels used to have this Native American sort of backstory rather than the current one, which has sort of changed more to the sort of feudal knight type world. And as someone most recently, probably 4 or 5 years ago now, but read the Horus Heresy series and all the origins of the Dark Angels in that story, it reminded me, oh yeah, I did know this, but I kind of pushed it away from my mind. But I think it did a decent job of explaining and introducing Genestealers and how infestation works, and about that feels more current still, I suppose, than the Space Marines and the Terminators and the chapter. That's definitely evolved more over the years since this story was written, but I did enjoy it.
Right. Yeah, because it's quite an interesting one. This, like, the story. So I had a few problems with it in terms of pacing and structure, but the story is an interesting take on Terminators versus Genestealers. I mean, really, Genestealer cults, essentially, isn't it? Because we get hybrids and we get a patriarch and that sort of stuff. But yeah, this was included. The entire story was also included in the Deathwing supplement for Space Hulk, where they brought in the Genestealer cults, the hybrids, into that game.
Yeah.
And you're right, it definitely does a lot of work to sort of say, okay, well, let's explore what exactly these things are. What are Genestealers and hybrids and Terminators? Because we've not spent a lot of time in the lore with them yet. Because at the time, Terminators even were relatively new, and it's a brand new thing. Let's explore it. Let's get into the story. So that then sort of as an interesting setup to say, right, we're going to have some Terminators go, and their intention is to recruit more Dark Angels. And the way it's set up here is that they can only do that, or they like to only do that, by going to their sort of the main world that they recruit from every 100 years or so, and they get the best warriors and they get inducted into the sort of training program to become future Dark Angels. Except this time they return to the planet and it's been decimated. All of the people have been wiped out. The only ones who are left now live in some sort of metropolis-esque kind of industrialized city under the rule of some kind of nefarious, what we find out
Yes.
are gene stealers. And you kind of get quite a, dare I say, plodding progression of the story
Yeah.
where the sort of most of the Terminators kind of talk about what they're going to do for a very long time. There is some really nice moments of reflection where you get characters who are sort of saying, well, this was our world and we abandoned our world in one sense, and we abandoned our people because we had a higher calling to protect the emperor and stuff. So there's
Yeah.
this interesting sort of internal conflict for some of the characters, and they feel
Yeah.
guilty about their world.
Yeah. I quite like, see, if I think about all the elements of the story, there's not any part I don't like, but I am with you on the pacing. There are parts where I thought it's a little bit slow. And I wonder if that's because they're trying to actually include all of these elements. So that part of the pacing is to do with the Space Marines discussing, and they're talking about their past and their cultural past, which is very pseudo, obviously Native American past as well. So they're trying to bring that into the way they talk and their rituals, but it takes all the pace out of the story because of that. I thought it was really, obviously they're introducing Dark Angels, I think, for the first time properly, because original Space was Blood Angels was the chapter in the box, unless I'm misremembering.
You're right.
Deathwing was this kind of introducing a new chapter as well.
Yeah.
And I like that it's kind of teaching as well. It's teaching about our home world. And there's almost that moment of, well, if we lose our home world, the chapter will die, because once we all go, there won't be anyone to take our place. And that jeopardy is there. So there's some really interesting elements and story arc to all of that. But yeah, I do agree about the pacing. There are times when you think, okay, or even just the way it's written and trying to remember which group is here and why they split off, so to speak.
Yeah, there's a really odd, because you do get most of the Terminators, most of them, they're not sure what they want to do. Do they want to go and sort of fight? Or should they just abandon the whole mission and leave it and basically bombard the entire planet from orbit and accept the loss of their world and their people? So they have a war council, and they spend a lot of time talking about, like you say, their own stories, how they became Terminators, how that informs their decision making. But the librarian has gone off on his own on a recon mission without any backup or any way to get backup or tell anybody anything about what he finds. He just goes into this industrial city. This sort of been built up over a couple of generations, and it's a real, like, it's basically a hive world, essentially. But it's also a very sort of 70s winter of discontent kind of, like, put upon miners and oppressive government
beggars.
Kind of thing.
The beggar's the best part in the story. Arms, give us arms, which is an amazing pun joke for a Genestealer story.
And it fully leans into that sort of version. They're really, I don't know that there's a really political point to it, other than it's the trappings of that, and sort of, let's just use that for the aesthetics of the story. But this librarian, so two heads talking is his name, and so one of the things that I struggled with quite a lot is that he sort of casts a spell or an illusion to make himself just look like anybody else in this place. But he's in Terminator armor, and he's going into like a tavern and like sitting on a stool, and he's having a beer, watching the people. And I know this is really pedantic, and you shouldn't get hung up on these details. I just couldn't imagine, even if people are seeing him as a regular person, I couldn't get my head around like how that was physically working. And that took me out, and I shouldn't have really, but it distracted me from the story for a good while, where I'm like, but how is he sat down? How is his stool going to take the weight of a Terminator? How is his hands going to get around even a stein of beer? I couldn't deal with it.
I'm guessing the splitting is trying to tell two stories at the same time. One of the leaving the group of Space Marines talking about, telling you all of that backstory, and the librarian was there so that you could learn more about what was happening in this new hive world and the Genestealer infestation. I think that there's even sort of them remembering back previous actions on another planet
Mm.
where there was a Genestealer infestation, and drawing on that. So there's a lot of information there,
Yeah.
being crammed into a short story.
Yeah,
Maybe
there is.
it's a longer short. It felt longer
It's
anyway.
one of the longer ones in the book. It's about a fifth of the book's length, just dedicated to this one story. And it's interesting, and we'll get to it later on, but the collection, the original publication of the collection, ended with a Genestealer story as well, which tackles them in quite a different way. And for me, this story's version of the sort of Genestealer cults and their hierarchy and their sort of society was less appealing. And part of that was because I couldn't, similar to the sort of psychic powers, I couldn't work out how it really worked, like why they'd created this. So this is an entire world, an entire people who are now in the thrall of a Genestealer and a patriarch and the cult, yet they still had like clocking off time and going to the pub and complaining about work, and there was still an elder in this city who remembered the before times and sort of hadn't bent the knee to the Genestealers. It's like, how is that guy still walking around? Like, so there were some elements of it that sort of didn't quite gel and didn't comfortably, immerse me in the story. Despite that, there were some interesting things as well. I mean, I quite liked the sacrifice that the librarian makes, and like he sends almost a psychic vision to the captain of the Terminators at the War Council to sort of let him know that he's sacrificed himself and done this sort of final act. And then that moment was quite good, I thought.
Yeah. I didn't dislike it at all, but it's a little bit messy and confused at times.
It is a bit confused. It is a bit. I mean, obviously, as you say, it's been sort of decanonized now, so this is not the origin of the Dark Angels anymore. I didn't personally have any kind of issue with the way in which they were trying to draw on certain aspects of sort of a First Nation peoples kind of Native American Indian culture, and explore that in the context of this other world, and sort of take some elements of that and try and bring that into a story. I actually think there's maybe even that could be done sensitively quite an interesting thing to explore.
I don't think they'd remove it now, actually. I think it's almost, I mean, without getting into modern politics of that kind of, which is an interesting topic in itself, but I think that was changed before modern times, where people would talk about that kind of thing. When you look at modern day Horus Heresy and you look at the white scars and the way that they're handled, leans completely into nomadic horse people from the Middle Ages and late medieval period. It's very, it's fine because it's done in a way that's respectful. And I think if it was handled in the same way now, actually, it would potentially be fine. But again, maybe it would be an issue. I mean, there's American sports franchises that have had to change their names because of it, and so I'm guessing it was a safer thing to do when they realized it could be problematic.
I don't even think it would have
and moved it.
But
yeah, if it was handled in almost a glorifying way, then it's absolutely great, isn't it? And it brings more diversity.
I think more, exactly, more representation. Because if anything, I think the worst way to go is to
more
just
European-esque white men.
Yeah, every Space Marine chapter is just European feudal knights, because that's less interesting when you do that. So actually having different cultures inform these different stories and give us different perspectives, I think is actually a good thing. But again, it has to be done in a sort of sensitive way. And I think that this story, I don't really have any issues with that, because I think it handles it quite respectfully, and it is given a kind of weight and meaning and relevance to the story. So actually some of the better stuff for me was that, like I say, that conflict that existed within the sort of key characters. So Cloud Runner is the captain who sort of brings together this council of the other Terminators and kind of says, right, well, we owe our allegiance to the Emperor because we all signed up to be Space Marines. And our duty is to protect the Imperium and do this. But we also had a sort of an earlier duty to our people and to our own culture, and these two things are now in conflict. So what do we do? What's the sort of right steps to take? And I think that poses an interesting question. And you get obviously a resolution to that by the end of the story, where the council ends now knowing that the librarian is dead, the patriarch has been killed, but there's still all of these Genestealers. We then sort of do a bit of a time jump to much later on, where we have another set of Marines arrive, basically to chastise these missing in action Terminators who never came back from their mission.
Yeah.
We discover that the reason they didn't, it's quite good. There's almost initially this kind of darkened throne room kind of moment where maybe Cloudrunner has been turned into a Genestealer himself. Is he a hybrid now? But actually, no. The reason they didn't come back was because they're repopulating. They saved the few people they could. They killed all the Genestealers. There's only a couple of Terminators left, and they've recreated the clans and the peoples who used to live there. And I thought that was quite an interesting resolution to the story. You know, they've done the right thing for their people, and then they argue, understandably so, and it's accepted as being correct, that it's also the best thing for the Dark Angels and therefore the Emperor.
Yeah, because they were gone 10 years, weren't they?
Yeah, exactly. And they've been rebuilding their society, so there will be future Dark Angels to recruit. So it's an interesting idea, I think.
Yeah, very interesting. I wasn't expecting that end, to be honest with you. It's like I said at the beginning, I don't think the themes throughout of it all seem to work. It just maybe there's enough there that's a synopsis for a full novel rather than and that's why the pacing feels off. And I do want to know, I don't know how the writing split was done here between Bill King and Bryan Ansell, but you do wonder whether Bill would have been writing more. And maybe that's a massive assumption. And maybe Bryan was like, put this in.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, based on nothing at all, literally nothing at all, only the sort of broader context.
Yes.
And, you know, what we now know about the sort of working pattern for Bryan Ansell, my suspicion is exactly what you said. There were a load of ideas that maybe came from Ansell. I would assume, and again, pure assumption, I would assume that the sort of almost the loric elements of the Dark Angels came from Ansell, and then King did most of the actual writing of the story. And I would also assume that is why the lore was later changed, because obviously Ansell would leave shortly after this. So they, free reign to just completely rewrite. If he'd been around for a few years longer, maybe this would have been entrenched and this would still be Dark Angel's origins. But that's a counterfactual that doesn't really matter. But yeah, I personally would not have wanted to have read a full novel of this, because I think it stretches my interest over the 50-page page count.
Yeah, I'm with you.
And some of that's pacing, some of that's structure, but generally, I don't think I didn't get on well enough with like the Genestealer representation. I didn't get along well enough with the sort of pacing that I would want to see it expanded.
It's fair enough.
But yeah, conceptually, interesting ideas. Not the best execution, and also not the best opener for an anthology of stories, but not a write-off by any means.
No,
we've read worse shorts.
I think.
And there's the moment at the end, isn't there? Because obviously throughout all of the Marines use their original names from the world.
Yes.
So Two Heads Talking is librarian, Cloudrunner is the captain, and then at the very end, I think we reveal for the first time that Cloudrunner is actually called Brother Ezekiel. And there's that moment of, is this the same? Is this Ezekiel that we will see later on in 40k lore? But it's probably not, is it?
Well, probably not. Who knows? But because the whole lore was changed. But it was definitely, I recognize that name, or at least I recognize that as a Dark Angels type name.
Yeah,
which was good. Whether that's it's a nice little connection.
Maybe someone read this.
it's cool.
I mean, that is an interesting point in and of itself, and that's probably one of the things where it could have been pushed more and explored more. Is the fact that these people had to rename themselves, like their real names were not acceptable for whatever reason when they became Marines.
Yeah.
Now maybe that's because you want to rechristen yourself as a new being because you've now taken on this new responsibility, or it may be because it's like a colonizing thing, and actually you now need to conform to the Imperium's culture. That could be something interesting to explore, and it doesn't really go into that at all. But
no, it's not something that's part of the modern law very much either. That's not.
Your name is your name, right?
Your name is your name, or at least one of your names remains or something. But yeah, it was interesting anyway.
Yeah, so a reasonable start to the collection. Probably not my favorite though.
No, I agree. It was fine, but it definitely wasn't my favorite out of the rest.
Yeah. Warped Stars by Ian Watson. In a rural farming town on an Imperial world, a young farmhand suddenly discovers a voice in his mind that is not his own. At first friendly, this seductive train of thought leads him to the precipice of darkness as an ancient entity crosses from the warp in search of a new friend. Fortunately, inquisitorial agents have been tracking the emergence of the boy's powerful psychic energies and arrive just in time to face down the malevolent robotic monstrosity before it can claim its new acolyte. So, Warped Stars, this is the first Ian Watson short story, but obviously we're going to see a lot more Ian Watson over the course of both the GW books and the box trees that come later. This one, quite an interesting tale, I thought, about the emergence of psychic powers, a small sort of young boy who maybe is getting some kind of nefarious attention from the warp, and there's almost a sort of police procedural kind of inquisitor investigation trying to track him down at the same time. I mean, what was your feeling on this one?
It was a little bit bizarre in places. It felt a little bit more like taking some of the short stories from the Warhammer novels and giving it a bit of an early 40k-esque sort of coating to it. I think he does a good job of introducing inquisitors, which as we'll see again later in the compilation, quite an important part in Warhammer 40,000 at this stage, whereas they become, especially away from the game, don't they? There's not something that were very important until we got to Dan Abnett writing about some rather famous Inquisitor. But so it feels like they're quite front and center here, and it's very much a kind of you're on a mission. There's disturbance in the warp almost. You go and investigate something's not right there, and that's along the backdrop as well of a quite a basic, almost feudal, rundown kind of planet, and that also tortures witches. So, being a witch is bad. They don't have wheels there apart from putting people on and
one wheel,
one wheel. So it feels quite almost Python-esque, and it's kind of, there's a bit of a dark humor to it. And I suppose Jomi is scared of witches or becoming a witch, but then at the same time, he starts hearing voices, and we all know as the reader that that's chaos in your head. But he's kind of that, but at the same time as him, he feels like an early pubescent boy as well, discovering other things at that time, and that gets interwoven into the chaos quite a bit. And the reason I bring it up is because it's kind of thread throughout the story. Really, it's hard to remove it. You could ignore that part of it, but Ian Watson brings it back quite a few times at points where you could have done without it in the story as well.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because yes, I think you're right that definitely is a sort of a real theme and something that is recurrent throughout the story. I quite liked it though, and I think it really worked in conjunction with chaos.
Yes,
it absolutely it spoke of like chaos would exploit these kinds of confused feelings and this kind of change, and all like chaos will take advantage of like how someone's body and mind changes as they grow up, and like that's absolutely the kind of stuff that chaos would be all about,
Yes.
is using those kind of vulnerabilities and those kind of moments to their own advantage. So it kind of that worked for me, and I actually really enjoyed this story on the whole. I thought this was a really fun one. The actual the way in which, because you're right, it definitely has shades of some of the Warhammer fiction we've seen. You could almost see a Conrad kind of sort of similarity in a way. So I quite liked that, when you have this sort of sci-fi mirror of this other story. And we're sort of seeing a lot of stuff from Jomi, from the boys' perspective, and there's some really good writing around how chaos emerges to him. So this voice forms almost as a mouth, and it's described as almost like this literal mouth forming within his mind. And obviously it's like metaphorical, but also this is warp and chaos, and so it could be literal for all we know.
Yes.
So there's a real weird kind of like it's gross, and there's a sort of physicality to it. Ian Watson's talked about wanting to introduce this kind of lurid, so almost like graphic kind of details to take advantage of the genre. And I think he does that here, and I think it really works. It's something about it.
It's not that it doesn't work, and that wasn't the point I was getting at. It was just that it seems pretty obvious, and there was another way of telling the story, I suppose.
Sure, yeah,
but it does work, and I don't mind it. But it's definitely, it's not quite gratuitous, but it's bordering on it at times. If you thought,
and that's
Brian Craig hinted for people watching this who have maybe not read it, but Brian Craig hints at it more. It's a little bit more, I'm just going to write it rather than actually insinuate. And I think it, as I said, I think it works. You were right, absolutely works with chaos, especially chaos at that time. It was there was a huge element of that to it, especially with Slaanesh. It doesn't really say what, it's not really necessarily a Slaanesh demon, is it? It's kind of left as you don't really know. But he's done very well. But he did feel like you could have, told a version of this story without those bits, and it would have still worked. And what you were saying about you fit in the old world of the con, you could absolutely completely reskin this in the old world and tell exactly the same tale, apart from they don't arrive on a spaceship and it's not a robot at the end. The rest of it you can pretty much tell. Maybe yes. At that time you probably could, because those two worlds existed in the same universe, I suppose, when this was around. But yes, it's good. It is good.
Yeah, and I think the other side of it being, so you're getting that like a little bit of a coming of age story, like you say, this sort of adolescence and discovering for this boy, he's attracted to one of the farmhand's daughter and stuff like that. You're getting that as one part of the story, and how chaos is infiltrating and is sort of insidiously corrupting that coming of age story. The other half of this story is the sort of police procedural, where you've got an inquisitor landing on the planet. Grim the Squat is introduced as a character, and there's a load of other Imperial characters as well, and they're trying to track down what they have. They've essentially seen there's a psychic spike on this planet, and it's a very important person that needs to be captured or killed even. You definitely get a sense. There's a bit of a weird one here where they talk about how 1,000 psychos are sacrificed to the Emperor every day. So they're important, and they're also numerous. But then you've also got like an entire spaceship with an Inquisitor and his retinue would be on the lookout for just one, and would go to a planet for just one. So you kind of get simultaneously, there's loads of them, and they're being sacrificed by the thousands, but also we will travel around the entire galaxy to find just one. So that's it's a little bit, that, and again, that's me being a bit pedantic.
No, it's right. It's a contradiction, but it's
a bit,
clearly done to fit whatever is necessary at the time, and it's One's the kind of the macro level idea, isn't it, of the way the Imperium works, and one's the kind of micro level detail of how we're going to tell
And
this story.
And it could be, especially at this time, the Imperium is just so inconceivably vast that maybe this is how it goes. In order to get that 1,000 psychers a day, there's literally an entire ship's worth of Imperial agents tracking down just one on a planet. But that's happening thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of times a day because the galaxy is so huge. And this is just
millions of, I don't know if there were millions of worlds at that point in the lore.
Sure,
there is supposed to be now. That's the current.
Yeah, maybe it is, and maybe there are, and there's hundreds of thousands of inquisitors hunting down hundreds of thousands of psychers all the time. So it could be that big. But yeah, I mean, I think the story sort of progresses. I mean, just actually on the planet. I mean, you mentioned it's a feudal world. It's kind of industrial farming as a planet. And it's quite interesting. You get the grox. It's grox farming and growing these guys. And then you get to the sort of climax of the story where the Inquisitor and his team have found the boy just as the boy is about to sort of be embraced or embrace this, whatever the chaos source of the voice is. A portal forms, and through it comes some kind of, I mean, I don't know what your read on this was, because it was a bit ambiguous to me, but it's almost, is it a robot? Is it a dreadnought? Is it a titan even? I couldn't really sense what scale we were talking about.
I thought big at one point, but then later on it feels actually maybe it wasn't. Originally I thought big.
Yeah, it felt,
this is a massive thing. It's
almost
like
maybe not full, maybe not like an Imperator Titan, but like a bigger robot than just a dreadnought.
But then at the end, when the demon's talking to him and explaining that he's got another of these machines that he wants to basically take his mind from his body, but physically it sounds like as well, almost dissect him painfully, remove his mind and his soul and place it in another robot. So he's got company, basically. So this demon who's lost in the warp has got company. At that point I thought, maybe this thing is smaller.
You know what's just occurred to me, actually? It could be a dreadnought, but it could be the Space Crusade dreadnoughts.
Okay.
But not a Space Marine dreadnought, because it didn't feel like that kind of shape and size. I know that sounds weird, but it didn't have that sense to me. It was more robotic. And those Space Crusade dreadnoughts, which would have been around shortly after this, are kind of have a feel of a robot, but they are chaos dreadnoughts. So maybe that was in the air somewhere. I don't know.
Like the origins of what the modern day, but the Deredeo is now.
It's like that's like a reinterpretation, isn't it? But in any case, you get this kind of robotic form. It wants to take the boy, and it's got a little compartment. It's going to put the boy in. You kind of get like almost like a possible future, a vision of what could happen where the boy is taken, and that's quite uncomfortable. But the Imperial agents all get involved. There's an Ogryn who just charges this robot dreadnought thing. Grim is there and does some nifty stuff. And we haven't even talked really about the Inquisitor. I quite liked him as a character. His name Torque Sepelian.
Sepelian,
which is a great name. Fantastic name.
Good.
And he, as a character, he's quite interesting because, I mean, again, just coming back to the police procedural thing, he definitely felt to me like I can't remember the character's name or even the actor now, but in CSI Miami, who's always putting his shades on at the start of an episode or taking his shades off at the start of an episode. He had that is David Caruso, is that his name?
Oh yeah, it might be his name.
He had that kind of vibe to me. He was like quite intense, all about solving the case. But then at the end, he kind of becomes obsessed with finding out where the dreadnought has come from and what's beyond the portal. And to the extent that he's almost he's considering just jumping through the portal into open void space, whatever's on the other side, just to see. And I thought that was quite interesting, like place for him to go.
Yeah, it's. I felt they didn't. I don't know. They didn't necessarily introduce them very well. It felt a little bit. Kind of you feel like they're off world talking about we got to go and save this boy or find the source of this
straight in, right?
But yeah, it felt like they was maybe slightly underdeveloped, but that was yeah, I think they can be more interesting to find out more about them in the future. But and Hatchard was kind of more like a blunt instrument as well, wasn't he? He's the commander of the Marines. I believe they're Space Marines, but again, the way they're talked about is because it's old 40k. I think they use the term men quite a lot. Sure. And because you've got an Ogre in there and you've got a squat, it feels very much like a kind of rogue trader combined Imperial Army thing.
Yeah.
Rather than, so you've got some Space Marines, but you've also got some Imperial Army maybe there as well. And and they're all under the same command. And, you know, they mentioned that they lost their chaplain on a previous mission. So you think, well, maybe there's Marines there. But you know, when chaplains were introduced to the game, I've been looking at it recently for chaplains and commissarials are in the same chapter in a White Dwarf. That was the same article. So they introduced chaplains and commissars at the same time. So maybe this is some kind of Space Marine led but weird mix of abhumans and humans and post-humans all in there.
That's a very interesting point. And you definitely this is still an era where it feels more acceptable, and abhumans are just mixing freely, and there's kind of no stigma there really.
Except
and everyone's more
because they're useful.
But everyone's just kind of like, it feels like for everybody these are just day jobs in a way.
Yeah.
Like if you're an inquisitor, you're still going to go home at the end of the day and, you know, have a drink and sort of relax in the same way that you would if you're an assassin, and the same way you would if you're an engineer or a space marine. You literally are just like, right, I clock on, I do my work as a space marine or as an inquisitor, and at some point, you know, I'll have a vacation and stuff. So there's like a real, like, it's a far more sort of I don't know what the term is, because I mean, I guess the general point here actually is that we'll see in all of these stories, this is way more like a lived-in universe, I think, than we will see later on in Warhammer 40,000's development.
Yeah,
like this feels more much like the fantasy stories we've read. They lean towards Warhammer Fantasy roleplay more than they lean towards Warhammer Fantasy Battles, because they're telling stories about individual characters who may be on a quest, maybe on an adventure, but they're basically living their day-to-day lives and doing some heroic stuff. And that's what we get with these stories. It's almost like if Warhammer 40,000 roleplay existed, these would be the stories for that,
I think you're right.
as opposed to the 40k battle game. Because, this is just people's day-to-day lives, and they just happen to be arresting a psyker today. You know, and I quite like that, actually. I think that works across the board. It's like quite an interesting, it's a different take on the universe that we don't see as much of anymore.
No. And those themes are very much from the Rogue Trader rulebook rather than later publications.
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
Which has got RPG elements to it anyway. And it does feel like it's not a tick box, but they're teaching the reader about the world, and that's where you've got a squat and an ogre that turn up in later stories as well in the same formula. In fact, the Grim, the squat even mentions, you talked about the Inquisitor Civilian wanted to go into the warp to find out what's there, but also the squat mentions, that robot, that must be an ancient STC. There must be a space hull up there in the void. Maybe there's more valuable STCs, and the value of STCs is something else that comes up later in other short stories. So it feels like these are important themes of 40k at the time, which are reintroduced again and again through these short stories.
Yeah, there's definitely stuff in here that does take root, as much as there's stuff that's completely gone now. I mean, this story, I think, could easily exist in the modern 40k universe.
Yeah, absolutely good.
There's nothing in this one that kind of contradicts anything, I don't think. I think there is, I mean, you're right about, like, you know, the way Ogrins and Squats and Inquisitors and Assassins are talked about. They're almost like character classes for a role-playing game, and they have that sort of, you know, in the same way you might talk about barbarians and wizards and elves and dwarves for Hero Quest or Warhammer Quest. That's kind of the sort of archetypes you get through this collection, and you sort of see, well, how do they work on a day-to-day basis? Let's find out. And this one is a good example of that. It's a good example. Like, this could be an adventure in a role-playing game of, we're going to go to an industrial farm world, and we're going to try and find. We've got to do a load of stuff, investigation to find where the boy is, and then when we get there, we'll have an action climax fighting some weird robot.
Yeah.
And yeah, I liked it, and I enjoyed Ian Watson's writing. I think he does bring that kind of like gratuitous, lurid kind of like it is unnecessary in a way, but that the very fact that it's gratuitous is what then makes it necessary, because that's how he wants the world to feel, and I think that's quite good. It worked.
I didn't mind it. I mean, yeah, it did make me think. Here we go. There's
definitely moments. We've got another Ian Watson story to come, and I think there are moments that maybe that cross my particular threshold.
Yeah, there are moments in that. I mean, the guy's got the horn, hasn't he? Let's face it. But still writes a good story at the same time.
He does. But yeah, overall, I really enjoyed this, and I thought this was because the pacing felt a lot quicker. The characters felt like it was exploring some really interesting aspects of 40K's universe in a way that I was really engaged with. So coming off of the sort of oddly paced, a bit slow Deathwing into this one, I was like, right, we've kicked up a gear now. We're into the fun 40K stuff. Let's see where it goes.
Yeah, I think so. It was good fun. Definitely good fun. It could be, I was just thinking about it. So as an Inquisitor story, it could be an Eisenhorn story now. It would still work. Right. Probably wouldn't have any Space Marines there. It would be Eisenhorn and his small band of followers doing the same job. But the rest of it could be rewritten now as an Eisenhorn story. So if you gave that synopsis to Dan Abnett and said, turn that into an Eisenhorn story, it'd absolutely work. And that probably shows how relevant it is still.
Interesting, just tangentially related to that, is that they did reissue this collection in around 2001 when the Black Library took off. And they had a number of extra stories added. So there's a couple of new stories. I think Graham McNeil and Gav Thorpe might have written some. They changed the order of the stories. Obviously, we know for the Inquisitor series that we'll be reading soon enough by Ian Watson, Grim the Squat turns up again. In those stories, for the reissued Black Library versions, they edited Grim out and they removed the Squat and replaced it with an engineer, because at the time Squats were no longer canon.
Were squatted, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They didn't apparently change this story though. So when they edited the updated versions, they basically disconnected Warp Stars from Inquisitor for some reason. So I don't know why that was. Maybe they just decided it wasn't worth the effort. But yeah, just an interesting
couple of lines, isn't it? So
yeah, and it's an interesting choice in and of itself. And maybe we'll talk about it more when we do get into Inquisitor. But I think we saw with Dark Future, when they reissued those, they updated things and changed timelines and changed references to pop culture. I do wonder how much of that has been done with these when they reissued them in 2001. Yeah. But yeah, just one of those curious decisions that happens. I'm sure there was a reason. Sure someone was given a particular brief on that. But yeah, overall, Warp Stars, it was a winner for me.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I did enjoy it. Odd parts, yes. Well, it's just, I don't know if it's even odd. I think it's things you're surprised maybe to find in that kind of story.
Lacrimata by Storm Constantine. On a routine delivery mission, the rogue trader vessel Dia Brava arrives at a pleasure planet to pick up cargo. The cynical navigator Solonets and the young astropath Shivania join their captain on a visit to one of their illicit new suppliers. The cargo is an illegal drug, lacrimata, that can have dangerous psychic consequences, but which is nevertheless a prized commodity even on Terra. As a relationship blooms between Navigator and Astropath, Solonets becomes concerned with the heretical politics espoused by his paramour, and things escalate quickly when Lacrimata leaks into the navigation pod and threatens to damn the ship in the chaos of the warp. Okay, the third story in the collection, Lacrimata. This one's written by Storm Constantine, which is a name perfect for 40K, if ever there was one. Absolutely fantastic. And this is quite it's it's one of the shorter. Well, it's kind of mid length, about 30 pages. This story, and it deals with an inquisitor. A navigator, a
Yes.
psyker, and a rogue trader, and a bit of an illicit kind of drug deal that they're doing on a planet. Did you have a sort of strong reaction to this story?
I think it did a pretty good job of giving a short tale that tells you about the life of a navigator and the life of a astropath, and how they're treated within society,
Hmm.
and the differences between their freedoms. I think that's what it's exploring in some ways, and about the frailty and of the astropaths and their connection to the warp versus the navigators. Also, frailties, but probably less dangerous for them, and definitely seen better in society. And there's that kind of interplay between these, again, more acceptable mutants
Hmm.
that work for the Imperium. The Imperium needs in order to do the things that it does. And you almost kind of feel sorry for them, and you explore that. So I thought that was quite interesting. And the drugs, the narcotics side was a way of kind of making a connection between the dangers that they could possibly go down. So it feels like um, it's almost like that drug exploration story with two young lovers in some ways, maybe going off the rails, doing things that they shouldn't do, or maybe they shouldn't try.
Hmm.
um and and an astropath probably really shouldn't be taking this drug or having it, because it opens her mind up maybe more to connections with the warp, which could be dangerous for not only for herself but for everyone. But that's the kind of the broader context of it. So it feels like it's got that kind of almost don't take drugs, kids kind of message in it, but not in a gratuitous way. It's within the story of I think the stronger part of the story is the navigator and the astropath and the way they
Yeah.
fit into the society. I think that's the main message that I took from it anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. So I loved this story. This was my
Yeah, me
favorite
too, me too.
in the book. I thought this was great. I thought the writing was really good. It was really evocative. It kind of this painted a picture of a 40k universe where every world is like is different and inhabited. And I guess there was a bit of that in the previous story as well, and Deathwing as well, to be fair. But it was almost like an episode of a TV show, like a Star Trek, for
Hmm.
instance, or a show like that, where you could go to a planet and there would be a whole culture on that planet, and you could interact with it and get a story from them, and then go to another planet and experience something else. But this one, with its with sort of delving into the mechanics of how rogue traders work, and the houses of the rogue traders and navigators and astropaths and all that sort of stuff, there was like we got into this really grimy underside of the 40k universe. Again, very much like a role-playing game, very much like the Rogue Trader role-playing game is trying to evoke, where you're getting to see, what are the shady deals that are happening in the back? What happens between the cracks of massive fleets and armies fighting against Tyranid invasions or what have you? What's just happening on a day-to-day basis? And it's stuff like this, which is a rogue trader has been sent to collect up a load of illicit cargo that's this drug that enhances your psychic powers and does other stuff like that. And it's an illegal substance, and he's smuggling it. But it turns out he's smuggling it back to the guys on Terra who want it for their psychers. So it's all this sort of shady political stuff going on. But then the real story, like you say, is about the Solonits, the navigator, and Shivania, the astropath, and their relationship that grows, that is then affected by their class and their status.
Hmm.
The fact that essentially the astropath is a slave in
Yeah,
this society, and then the thoughts of chaos that come into that when you're being oppressed and sort of exploited in that way, and then how the drug preys on and influences and sort of then
yeah,
enhances that with
yeah.
dire consequences.
opens her mind almost to show her something
Yeah.
alternative, maybe.
Which is the last thing you want in the 40k universe, is for your mind to be opened, right?
Opened,
as soon as you start
especially
questioning,
when you're an astropath.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Because that's where the chaos gets involved. But there was some really amazing details in this. So when they first arrive at the planet, they're sort of going in and they're dropping out of warp, into real space as they come into the planet. And there's kind of this sort of almost this psychic construct within the warp of these massive gates.
Yeah.
And the navigator is like, he's almost got to double check. He's like, is that real? And it's both real and not real because it exists within the warp, but it's been kind of constructed as this dramatic arrival. And that's absolutely my imagination of the 40k universe, is just grand, kind of over the top, enormous kind of psychic constructs that exist just because it can in this universe. And I thought that was great. And then the sort of descriptions of the world, there was really good character dynamics, because you've even got the navigator he's been injured he used to be in the Imperial fleet. He's been injured, so now he's working for the rogue traders and the family. And the rogue traders kind of got an awkward relationship with him. He's trying to be matey, but he's a superior. There's kind of this, there's this sort of odd kind of vibe.
He's friends with his father, isn't he? So part of the reason. There's little bits of backstory that you never fully explore, but it's enough to really add some depth to the story. And he's kind of on the ship as a favor to his father, and you found out he's been injured, so something's happened before that wasn't brilliant. He's still just recovered from his wounds for that, so he's not having a good time of it at the moment, is he? Because this is a bit of a trip for him as well.
Yeah, definitely.
But the layers are really good.
Extra web of, like you say, that sort of the dynamics and the sort of off-screen extra drama and backstory is really good. But yeah, the relationship that grows quite quickly between the two main characters, but then it very quickly also sort of turns dangerous when she starts talking about some of, maybe we need to question how this society works, and I don't have the privileges that you have. I'm kind of locked in here. And he's very much like, well, I'm not too keen on this, actually. Yeah. But then there's an amazing sequence that I thought was just really, really, really well written, where he sort of slides into the ballista, or the sort of pod where he will take them into warp. And this already is set up and established as quite it's a taxing thing to do. It's exhausting. It has a cost on your mind and your body because you're engaging with the warp, and it's very dangerous. And then he slowly realizes that actually he's been tainted by this drug. Somehow it's in the air. It's in the room with him. And then it kind of spirals. His panic, I really felt his panic as it sort of starts to get chaotic, and with a small and a big C, as like he's getting visions. He then sees Shivania like approaching him. It kind of reminded me of Event Horizon in a way, this kind of real visceral horror scene. And I was worried for him. I was like, how is he going to get out of this now? The whole ship's gone now because they're in the warp and it's going to go south real quick. So yeah, I was right there.
Yeah, it's really, it's some of the writing is very similar to some of the best writing in the Heresy series, and you will see these kind of characters explored maybe just in little sections within a wider story. So it fits in. It feels canon enough that it would work in those stories as well. It is really very, very good.
Yeah, I liked it. I did. I checked out because Storm Constantine didn't write anything else for GW Books, unfortunately. I think her career was sort of taking off at the same time, so she went on to write a number of her own sort of series and books. I'm very, very tempted to read more of her work because I really, really enjoyed this. I would have loved to have seen more stories by Storm in the 40k universe. Like if there had been another anthology that had one of her stories in, I think that would have been awesome because really, really good. Yeah, just really spoke to me. It definitely captured 40k, at least what I want the 40k universe to feel like. This story really captured it for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've got everything, haven't you? You've got that kind of you learn about navigators and astropaths. So you've got that kind of, again, if you're coming to the 40k universe new, you're learning about it by doing those. You're learning about the kinds of worlds, which is really vibrant, colorful, aromatic, literally world.
Yeah,
It felt like the ship's almost landing in Marrakesh or something like that. Really
yeah,
vibrant, and you've got the sort of the darker side. You've got this love story. You've got the almost the oppressed semi-slave, and you've got the sort of the ultimate, the one part of the love story decides, I'm not going to give up for everything. This is madness, and just survives.
mm.
And she knows that she's going to will be put to death when they land. And he kind of helps her by giving her some more of the drug, or at least the oil, which we find out in the story that the oil is actually poisonous.
Mm.
So just smell it, it gives you a nice buzz, but don't drink the oil. So he gives her a little flask of the oil so that she
Yeah,
can take her own life at the end of it. So it's quite sad at the end of it
it
as well,
is.
but it's also the best thing that could happen to her because she's going to lose her life in a much worse way. So
Yeah,
it's really just a good story all around. So
yeah,
many
really good.
elements into.
There's a bit of humor in there as well. I mean, one particular moment that stands out is because it's a renowned, almost a pleasure planet in some ways. And there's
Yeah,
I think it's the chaplain who on the ship who's like going to go down. He's like, I'm just going down for some supplies, but everybody else on the dropship is like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, sort of.
yeah,
They know what he's really going there for. So there's like stuff like that was just that had a bit of the humor of the 40k universe to it as
yes,
well. And
yeah,
I
that
quite,
works very well.
I like that idea. Like I say, a very lived-in world that is a bit grimy, and everybody's a little bit untrustworthy, and it's kind of, it's almost the best version of like when you see a good Star Wars story where it's like really lived in and a bit grotty
Yeah,
and sort of everything's run down, but you can
yes.
still have magnificence within it as well. And yeah, it absolutely worked for me. So I loved this. This might be one of my favorite stories of all of the stories we've read so far. It's not going to knock off some of the Jack Yeovils from the top of my list, but this is it's close because it was a
Yeah,
really good
I
one.
can see that. I wouldn't disagree. Definitely, it shoots well above quite a few. So, um, I don't think I'd ever make a final decision if I was trying to list them all in order. I'd debate
But you're going to
far
have
too
to
many
when we get there.
quandaries.
We're gonna
How are
have
we
to
going to
do
have to
the. We're
list
gonna have to
every?
do a full tier ranking. Yeah, we're gonna have to sit
That'll be
down
an
with every
8 hour
single story and
story.
and do the full S to whatever tier and just take them one by one. A full
I think we're going
four
to need a big
5 hour
whiteboard.
stream. Monastery of Death by Charles Stross. On a non-imperial world of feudal warlords, a monastery stands protected by a sect of mysterious monks with a secret power. Imperial agents enter negotiation with the monks in search of access to lost knowledge, and a political power play leads to bloodshed, settled scores, and deals in which everyone thinks they won. But who walks away at the end with control of the sacred technology? The STC. Okay, Monastery of Death by Charles Stross. This is actually the shortest story in the collection. We're sort of visiting a monastery world, very different to the worlds we visited recently, but we're going to get some of the similar sort of characters turn up from the Imperium. Did you get on with this story? Enjoy this one?
I think it was fine. Like you said, it worked well because it was short.
Hmm.
And it was dark enough. It's quite a nice sort of dark feeling to it. I like the exploration at the beginning of we meet some some monks at the time in a monastery that could be anywhere in the world or any world at any time period. Really, they're quite timeless when you kind of go to that pseudo religious thing, and you get the impression they are relatively religious still. And you find out this is a world that hasn't yet fallen under the imperial diktat and rulers. They've somehow gone missing. They've gone hidden, but they learn that they're about to have a visit from the Imperium, and they kind of prepare for it, don't they? I quite like that, the way you've got an idea that there are worlds yet that have somehow not been discovered as part of the Great Crusade, or somehow sort of been missed as a moon or something or other. And then you get the other side of the story, I suppose, don't you? The Imperium side of, well, we found this world, we've got to go and deliver the imperial truth. But also, we think they might have some stuff we're after as well, which is what they're really after. And they're all things that are relevant through 30k all the way through to 40k in terms of what the expansion of the Imperium, refinding worlds that it lost. And that's, yeah, it's a great crusade story, really, set in 40k, and I quite liked it.
Yeah, I mean, so this one didn't quite work for me overall. We had a great debate about this one on my Patreon live stream discussion, where we sort of get together every month to talk about the books and to basically a live book club. And I struggled with it because it felt to me like it was all building up to like a big twist, this one. And then when we actually get to the ending, which we'll talk about, it wasn't really a big twist. It was a bit flat for me. Yeah. So we have the structure of the story is, like you say, we were introduced to these monks, and they have some power, and it's not clear what their power is. It's kind of talked about in terms of like a strength of power, a sort of that they can do something, and they're fearsome in some way. And the Imperium, when they turn up, they have a level of respect for these monks because of this power that they have. And then when the actual Imperium lands, it's the ambassadors that are sent are actually an assassin and an Armite, and they are negotiating rather than just using the brute force of the Imperium. They're negotiating because of this power that these monks have. Then there's a bit of a scuffle, and the Arbite dies, and one of the monks dies, and then the assassin and the other monk just kind of agree, yeah, you can access our historical records, our paper records.
Yeah.
And then that's ultimately the sort of resolution of the story. The Imperium are happy because they've got access to the records, and the assassin didn't like the Arbite anyway, so she's not bothered about him dying. And then the monks are happy because then we get the big reveal. Actually, the paper records aren't the real secret. The real power is an STC that's hidden on the world. And that's kind of the big sort of, I don't want to say it's a mic drop, and it's not set up like a mic drop, but it's kind of set up to be more important. And I just kind of felt like, oh, okay. Like, so I didn't leave it with I didn't leave wowed by an end moment or a twist or a whatever.
It feels just like kind a setup for another story, maybe.
Set up for something more. Yeah, it just didn't feel like, it didn't feel like a conclusive kind of moment of, it wasn't revelation at the end of the story. It was just a thing that happened.
I think sometimes with short stories that they're there to just sort of tell a short moment in time, explain the way things may be, and in that sense you get less of a payoff. And it feels like that's what this was trying to do. That's maybe why my biggest takeaway was it was interesting how it explained about the reconquest. Again, this is another story that teaches you a little bit about what Warhammer 40k universe is about. Talks to you a bit about past eras, talks about Age of Strife, lets you know that these worlds, these human worlds, have been lost to the Empire, and now the mission is to take them back. And most of it's already been done, but occasionally we find a new world, and when we do, they may well have, and it brings it back. We've mentioned it already, STCs and standard standard template constructs. And the paper library is the paper versions of those, and that's why they didn't want to attack. Not so much, I think they're slightly wary of the monks, but I think they're supremely confident that they can force and take over this world. But it was a way of doing it with losing less lives, and also making sure that the important library wasn't destroyed in the process. And yes, there's a little bit of a gotcha with yes, there's an actual construct, but that also feels like that's not important to the story. The story could have still gone the same way without it. And the real thing is that they achieved the mission, and that Judith, the assassin, who's more of a diplomat than an assassin in some ways, well, she has assassin skills. She also foresaw what was going to happen. She said it would take 2 deaths in order to secure what they wanted. And the deaths were obviously Joachim, the Araman, the Arbites, and the monk.
Yeah, because the
who was
monks are
actually
also
superior to Tenzing, because
yeah,
Tenzing was playing the role of the master, but he
yeah, and I
wasn't
guess,
actually the master.
and
So he
this
was
might just be
almost like
on
a
me and my comprehension, right? But I
mm,
didn't really understand or appreciate why they all felt that way. So why did
yeah.
everybody agree, except for the Arbite guy, that two people were going to have to die? It's like, oh well, there needs to be a show of strength and a give and take. But I didn't really feel like that was the like why. Why did the Tenzing the monk have to pretend to be the superior? I
I
mean, this
think
could
that
just
was
be on
just a way
me,
of
but
protecting, wasn't it? It's a bit like your Padme stroke character in
sure.
Star Wars, isn't it? Dressing up as one of the handmaidens rather than and the handmaiden dresses as the
But then
usually
Tenzing
princess
actually
to protect
does
them.
become like is granted level of
Yeah,
mastership.
because he wanted the job of the person who ended up dying,
Yeah,
which he wouldn't have had in peacetime because he wouldn't have died. There's other little bits, isn't there, about this? There's other monasteries on this world, and there are also sort of warlord gangs and things, but this seems to be the most influential of the monasteries. But at times of war, the monks would have had promotion because the master of temporal administration would have been an important position, but he may have lost his life. But because they've had been at peace, it meant that Tenzing was kind of under him for a while, and this moment enabled him to get his promotion. So maybe that's part of the conversation piece at the end as well. He was happy for it to agree with Judith to yeah, we'll give you access, because he knew at that point he's just gained because his actual boss has just died right next to him. So there's lots of little bits that could be explored further, I think. But the actual oh yes, and we've got a real SDC buried in the basement. Yeah, you're right. That wasn't such a great payoff, but that's not the bit I suppose I really took away from it. It just felt
yeah.
like that was we could return to this if we wanted to, and expand this story further, but
I think I'm
wasn't needed
probably
that bit. The
being
story is as good as it was on its own.
yeah, no, you're right, and I think I am probably being a bit ungenerous, but it does come down to like my reading comprehension, I guess, in that I don't
Mm.
think I picked up on some of the details maybe I was supposed to.
Yeah,
So I wasn't really sort of feeling all of the drama and the components of the characters' motivations and what was really going on. Um, so yeah, some of it probably sits with me on this one. Um, but yeah, just I didn't. Maybe I should revisit it and give it some more time. But on that first read, it just didn't work for me as a complete story. I don't think.
yeah, yeah. It's not an amazing story, as I said. It was more the most interesting point I thought of all of it was attempting to tell a tale of a world that wasn't yet under the kind of the remit of the Imperium.
Yeah,
For me,
which
that was the most interesting part of it, rather than what it actually delivered.
and that's I hadn't actually really sort of dwelt on that idea, and I think that's a good shout. Yeah, and the also the like Ezekiel, we get Araman, and a name
Mm.
that
Yeah,
we'll
a
see
name that
again.
we will see again, definitely.
Yeah. But yes, I mean Charles Stross. I've heard really good things about some of his other work. I don't think he wrote anything else for 40k either, so I think he
Not
was just
sure.
another one and done. But yeah, I think I'd like to try out some of his original work that's not 40k related, but this one didn't quite land for me.
Right. Yeah, makes sense.
Seed of Doubt by Neil McIntosh. Following a crash landing on an Imperial dust world, an Inquisitor and his retinue track a possible Nurgle infection to a long-abandoned ghost town. Discovering that other survivors from the crash have arrived first, an initially happy reunion turns to terror when the sanctioned Psycho realizes that the other survivors have become tainted by Nurgle as well. In a final standoff, the agents of Chaos are dispatched with the help of an ancient Slan technology, but the Psycho must weigh her doubt about the Inquisitor against the needs of the Emperor in a tense final confrontation. Right, Seed of Doubt by Neil McIntosh, another relatively short one in the collection. This is about another Inquisitor landing on a different planet and a very different character of Inquisitor to the one we've seen so far. But this goes in a completely different direction. So this leads us to Nurgle, sort of Nurgle infestation, or maybe an
Yeah.
alienoid presence of
think
some other
no.
kind, some old one action
A bit of both.
as well.
A bit of both, isn't it?
A bit of both. And it's kind of to me, it had almost a sort of Wild West kind of cowboy feel. But what was your takeaway?
Yeah, I think it's got that. My least favorite of the ones we've talked about today, probably.
Right.
It feels a little bit more sort of linear, and you can guess most of what's going to happen, apart from the maybe slight weird introduction of a slan. But then it's not the first time that it feels like a slam maybe shouldn't be in a story in one of these series. I don't know. I've not got any really strong feelings about it. I didn't super enjoy it. It was okay, but all of the others, there's bits I've really quite liked, and I take something away from in a positive way. This is the first one that, and it's kind of a very meh to me, I'm afraid.
Sure. Yeah, I can see that. I mean, one of the things that worked for me with this was that sort of cowboys going. So there's crash landing on the world, and there's been 2 pods that have landed. One's got some Imperial Guardsmen in, the other one's got the Inquisitor in, a couple of squats, and they are basically tracking a sort of plague victim to a ghost town, and it's a ghost town that also happens to be maybe the site of some slan technology or something. And when they arrive, trying to track down this plague victim who's fled there, they discover that the Imperial Guardsmen are already there, even though they were supposed to have crashed somewhere far afield. So they shouldn't have arrived yet. And then we find out they crashed in the ghost town and already infected by Nurgle. And I thought that was quite a cool setup as a sort of mid-story twist. Okay, actually these guys, because you also get quite a cool sequence where the Inquisitor first arrives and he thinks they're just that the guardsmen are fine, and he's about to shake one's hand, and then Danielle, the psycho who's with him, is like, wait, no, there's something wrong about these guys. And it's a sort of standoff, and I quite liked that sequence.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds better when you describe it than it felt that it was delivered.
Sure.
That sounds really harsh. Because leading up to that point, there was quite a chunk before that I felt that was a little bit slow and ponderous. You didn't really know why. It felt like a long time to establish why they were really there. It felt a little bit kind of, are they on a mission? Have they crashed? Sure. Yes, both, but it didn't feel like one was the kind of the true arc of the story is we're on this mission. Like the previous examples of Inquisitors, they are on a mission, whereas they sort of are, but they had a bad landing or something, and they're trying to get the other side on the radio as well as so on the Vox, sorry, on the radio. So yeah, that part is good. Probably the best part in the story. That kind of sort of switch moment, that horror moment, and then they end up shooting one of them and they get back up again and stuff. So it's quite good. But yeah, the way you described it as a synopsis definitely made it feel better than I think the way it was delivered. Yeah,
because you then get there's certain odd developments from that point on, because then the Nurgle guys retreat back into the town, and the Inquisitor finds out from the locals that there's another route into the town over some water, but nobody goes there. And there's some stepping stones that you can use. And they go to that place, and then basically the Nurgle guys know they're coming anyway, and you just have the same ambush that would have happened here.
Yeah.
It just now happens somewhere else. So there's kind of this extra movement that's not quite necessary. But then you have this action scene that kind of plays out okay, I think, where all the guardsmen, the bad guy guardsmen are picked off and the good guy guardsmen are picked off, and there's the Inquisitor versus the main villain fighting on one of the stepping stones in the water. And the psycho who's been injured, she sort of intervenes to try and help as well. And then something else intervenes, doesn't it, Stu?
Yes, it does. This is why that water's there, isn't it? So that they can crowbar this there, and I think maybe that's my problem with the story is that I felt as a short story as well. It needs to be about discovering Slan, space Slan,
Yeah.
or it needs to be about Nurgle and the plague infestation. But to have this Slan to kind of, I don't know, I just don't understand why it's there with a story about Nurgle. What would you trying to tell the story of Nurgle or the Slan?
Because
The
it's a
pool is
completely
called, what is
unexplained.
the pool called? The pool's called the Styrus or the Stoyira,
Right.
which means the one who waits. So it's got a
Sure.
different old name.
Yeah.
And obviously the one who waits is a frog under the water that can come
Yeah, but
out
like
and
a
kind of
liquid robot frog or
a
something.
liquid robot frog, yeah, that comes out of the water and kind of saves you as well
Sure.
as kind of, yeah. It's,
Yeah, because it only takes the Nurgle guy, and the Inquisitor survives. I mean,
yeah,
you do then get quite a cool final moment with Danielle, the Psyker, and the Inquisitor have not got on throughout the story. The Inquisitor is really distrustful of Psykers, her in particular, and he's painted in a very different way to our David Caruso Inquisitor of
yeah,
earlier, who was all about getting the job done and seemed pretty cool. This guy's a bit of a jerk, and
yeah.
doesn't he seems a bit inept as well.
Yeah, he's a captain of men rather than a psycho with any kind of real ability, isn't he?
Yes, very much so. And then the Psyker Danielle basically she pulls a gun on him because he's just had a fist fight with a Nurgle guy, and she's
Yeah,
like, "Well, maybe you've been infected. How can we be sure that you've not
and
been
he's already
infected?"
injured.
And he's yes, exactly. Um, and then again, we get a bit of a time skip, and she basically, because she had the seed of doubt that maybe he was infected, she's just killed him outright.
Yeah,
Maybe out of a little bit of spite as well. And then she's
yeah,
just sort of she's taken his Inquisitor badge, and she's now the Inquisitor,
yeah,
which is kind of
yeah.
it was obviously the rules were not quite as clear about how Inquisitor stuff works at the time. But I thought that was a perfectly good little like twisty kind of ending.
Yeah, I mean that's again the Western thing that she's
Yeah,
now the sheriff, and
sure,
that's the
yeah.
interpretation of Inquisitor in this story.
Mm.
And the Nurgle was the big bad in the desert. There's still no room for the Slan really. I don't know what the Slan's doing there. So I think it'd have been a lot better without the Slan. If it was just focusing on another Chaos God and introducing you to Nurgle and the Plague and that kind of thing, I think that story works really well.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think it would have been much better. I mean, I think the Slan might be. I'm trying to remember if there's another fantasy story, but I feel like the Slan are 2 for 2 or 3 for 3 on poor appearances in GW
Yeah.
books fiction. Like every time they've turned up, it's been pretty uncomfortable for the story.
It's probably there's a reason why they're not in the world anymore. They are better as a way of exploring origins of worlds.
Yeah,
and then left as that. I mean, they sort of turn up in the Horus Heresy stuff.
Okay.
And that's a big conversation. But there's something for offline because that will totally disrail this.
I'm assuming they don't like turn up as like out of the water and they're just like grabbing.
No, they don't jump
Horus.
out of the water and kill Horus or anything like that. But you've got you've got the whole idea of perpetuals built into the Horus Heresy, and there are a number of different perpetuals and immortals and really powerful magic users that have links with some of the other races. So you have some Eldar influences and things, and their own kind of views of the world and the Imperium and man, so it's all done very, very well. And there's slant type creatures that kind of, it's all hinted at. It's what you mean. Olaneus. You may have heard of a guardsman called Olaneus Pius, which is original lore that was if you read the sort of the fiction from the first guard regiments that's on that box set, and it says Olaneus Pius is in the foreground. He was rumored to be the guardsman that wounded Horus in order. So all of that kind of stuff. They bring in some of those elements into the Horus Heresy story. So it's done in a good way. But when you bring them in as a combat character, it sort of jumps up like a fish out, literally like a fish out of water
Yeah.
to kind of solve your problem for you, kill your bad guy. You didn't need that. You had two people left, a psyker and an inquisitor that you'd expect between them would manage to kill these Nurgle infected people and
Yeah.
win the day. And it's just it kind of just made the story weird, where it could have been a fine short story based on a Western style setup.
It sort of removes a bit of the tension as well, doesn't it? Because it's a
Yeah,
Deus Ex Machina, like
exactly what it was, and but when one wasn't needed, so there was a natural end to that story.
Yeah. But this, I mean, this is a Neil McIntosh story. I think I'm right in saying that this was the author who wrote one of the stories in Route 666,
Oh yeah,
which
yeah, the name rings a bell now.
featured a Deus Ex Machina of its own as well. So that was
Okay.
an infiltration mission where the sanctioned op encountered. It turned out that his own boss was the bad guy, and they sort of captured. And then
yeah, we didn't like that one, did we?
up. It didn't play too well. I mean, that one had more problems than this one, I think, for me.
Yeah,
but there's certainly similar.
You remove that part from this story, it's fine. It's not.
Yeah, and
still not great, but it's fine as a short story in a compilation like this to tell a little.
I agree, yeah. And there were, so I certainly didn't hate it, and I think there were some elements that were quite fun and quite interesting. Like I say, the sort of Wild West setup and some of the character dynamics. I actually quite like that there's an Inquisitor who's just unlikable and doesn't get on with his sort of second in command. I think that's perfectly interesting.
Normal.
One thing that I thought was odd, and I might have missed it, was that the plague carrying character that they chased to the ghost town, I don't recall finding out what had happened to him. He's just sort of not mentioned. If he is mentioned, it must be offhand. But
he was killed by the
is he just killed by the Nurgle guy?
By the guard, I think, the ones that had turned. Okay. I think they got there.
Which seems odd, because they were chasing him because they thought he was infected by Nurgle.
Yeah, again, you felt like he should have been almost leading
at least part
somehow
of
become
it.
their leader or something.
That
he'd gone away and become powerful. Yeah, it felt like the story started in one way in mind, and then he changed his mind about the direction, almost like he suddenly was told halfway through writing it, you've got half as many words. And he's like, how am I going to end it now? Slang.
Yeah. Yeah, the ripcord of GW book storytellers. You'll break glass in emergency, and a slan will arrive. This was probably my least favorite of the stories in this collection. I think.
Yeah, thinking ahead, to what's coming, the next two that are coming, then yes, this is it was my least favorite, by comfortably as well.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, for me, it wasn't because of my issues with Monastery of Death. I think it wasn't like way behind anything else, but yeah, it definitely has more problems for me than that one. Devil's Marauders by William King. On a hellish jungle world, the members of an Imperial Guard squad are forced to make a desperate march against the clock to avoid a devastating orbital bombardment from their own fleet. Contending with the harrying forces of heretics, the jungle itself, and the maddening bleakness of constant war, the squad are whittled away, before finally making it to safety, only to realise that real safety is still at least a day's march away. Okay, so we get another William King story but this one's just William King himself, and this is Devil's Marauders. So kind of a sort of Vietnam-style squad of Imperial Guard story in the jungle, fighting against sort of what are described in this story as heretics who are out in the jungle and are sort of chasing them. But really, there's a certain element of the story is very much about the Imperium's military failings as well.
Definitely.
I mean, what was your sort of your read on this?
I quite liked it. It's very much, it's very Ronseal, if we use a sort of very anglicized term or something, but it does what it says on the tin. It is very much, you want a small squad of survivors on what seems to be impossible mission to survive, fighting their way through a jungle from one point to another with the odds looking bad. It's that story. They didn't exist at the time. This is before Catachan was really kind of developed. But you'd imagine if this was written from second edition onwards, they would have been Catachans as well. You could probably imagine them that way if you wanted to. But he does that well. There's lots of little nods to the wider world, which I quite liked in it. So this is a planet that creates spores, which they harvest them for psychers, because the spores have an effect on psychers. They help enhance their abilities, which is quite cool. We meet Sal, the sanctioned psyker in the squad, and she's got sort of stains from using the spores, which is on drug use spores. I think it's just nice little elements like that. And the world is pretty grim. There's like dream spiders and things that are mentioned in it. It's quite good. It mentions lots of stuff from the game as well. Again, you get that with Bill King's stories, don't you? So before they battle, at one point they're taking stim inhalers to give themselves a rush before they fight. But it is very kind of linear. Yeah, I quite liked it. It was fine. I'm not going to remember it forever, but if you're a 14 to 18-year-old kid who wants to write names on the basis of your Imperial Guard units, which I definitely did at that stage, this is the kind of thing you imagined in your head of your toy soldiers. I think that's what it's doing, and that's what Bill King does well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's all fair. I mean, for me, I enjoyed this one quite a lot. I think this was probably my second favorite of the collection. It is exactly what you say, and it is exactly what it sets out to be, which is let's do a Vietnam inspired story of just war is hell for these Imperial Guardsmen. And it's hell for a number of reasons. The people they're fighting, the environment they're fighting in, and the people they're fighting for. Just everything about it is rubbish, basically. So, and we just get to see how rubbish it is over the course of 24 hours. Because the setup is quite simple. They're fighting against these heretics, but the quadrant that they're fighting in on this world has been deemed lost by their superiors. So they're going to be orbitally bombarding it, just destroying everything. So they've got 24 hours to basically march out of the jungle to the other quadrant. They're being harassed the entire time by these heretics. And at some point, the heretics get in front of them as well. So they're expecting to be ambushed. And then they do eventually make it out of the quadrant. They manage to fight, very few of them left, but they fight through the heretics. They get out of the quadrant. They escape the orbital bombardment. And then there's a fantastic sort of end moment, the catch-22 kind of moment, really hammering home the sort of satire of war is hell sort of thing, of they arrive and then even the new quadrant they've just arrived at is being evacuated because it's also going to get orbitally bombarded. So they just need to march again for the next 24 hours.
Yeah.
And that's just where it ends.
That's the end.
Yeah. Good. And so I thought it worked really well as this kind of just, it's about the frustration that these guys are having, but you do get loads of cool character stuff. You get loads of cool action stuff. You're fighting against like heretic Imperial robots at one point. The world that they're fighting on is just really cool. So the idea is it's a jungle world with a super dense jungle, which is kind of 3-tiered because you get this kind of swampy, dark ground. And there's these sort of enormous snakes and spiders and all sorts of stuff down there. You fall down there, you're done for. And then the canopy above it is so thick with branches and carpet moss that's where all of the action takes place. So all of the sort of ground is actually however high above ground, and if you fall through, then you're in trouble. And that's really cool. And then there's another layer above, so you can't even see the sky. And if you ever get through there, you sort of see the beautiful, wonderful sky, and you very rarely do. I just thought that was a really good alien world on which to tell this story.
Yeah, it's quite unique, isn't it? In the sense that it's taken a very normal formulaic kind of thing, and turned it into something quite unique. And beginning it in a 40k way. It's just the classic 40k-ness of it. Well, let's take a jungle,
but just like really times it by 40,000, and then we're gonna have a real jungle now, and that's great 40k work, I think.
Yeah, it does. I mean, the commissar in it is the commissar right out of the army list at the time.
Yep.
There's no since that point, and there's lots of commissars in stories. So we know Gaunt, and you get the idea that they're not the rule book commissar. They're not just this. Well, we'll kill you. There's a little bit about him judging. There's a wounded officer, isn't there? I can't remember his name, Michaels or something. He's injured, and then towards the end, he basically says, "I've failed you, failed my duty," and he asks the commissar to give him judgment. Bang, bang, gone. And there's a part where Nipper, who's the kind of the main character that we see the story through, he's at the end just had enough of it so much. He's just had enough how scared he is, his constant kind of toil of being on the front line, that he's just about to go to the commissar and say, "I can't do it anymore. You know, give me my moment, kill me." But he's pulled back by Sal, and he doesn't. And then at the end, one of the final fight scenes, he's having that moment of almost, he's so frightened, he's going into that shell shock kind of point. He can't stand up, doesn't think he can do it. And Borsky, the commissar, comes up and says, "You stand up and fight, or I'm going to kill you. You die like a hero, or you die." And then he finds his courage, but then the commissar's killed as well.
Yeah.
So it's pretty grim in that sense as well. But
good. Brutal.
Ticks a lot of boxes.
And I think it's because it's bleak. It's like it's a fun, it's a fun sort of bit of satire 40k story, but it's also bleak in its overall message of this is grim dark war that 40k is famous for, because it's drawing on parallels to real bleak wars. But yeah, that sort of the absurdity, almost Blackadder-esque absurdity of they talk about how they've invaded this world, and because the spores are so important, that's why they've committed so much manpower to it, because they thought they could win. And then 6 months later, they've determined that they can't win, so they're just going to bomb it, the entire thing. Yeah. So you kind of get this it was totally pointless then. We spent 6 months just wasting lives and wasting time.
Yeah,
when you could have just bombed it.
There was just a handful of them left from there.
Yeah,
the Marauders are the group, and there was something like 30 left at the beginning of it, I think, from the group before. They're all from the same hive world. It feels very Necromunda-esque. They talk about gang tattoos and that kind of thing, which at the time was the law for the guard. Most of them came from hive worlds, and they were maybe gangers, and they were recruited from these gangs or from these hive worlds, and they had the Imperial Guard uniforms, but they were also marked with their previous lives and their gang tattoos. And again, you've just got to read the sort of the Rogue Trader army lists, the compendium army lists, which I've been doing recently for a project, and you can see all of that stuff there, and it's just repeated on the page.
Yeah. So I liked it. I actually thought this was quite almost a cinematic or a sort of televisual kind of format. I could absolutely imagine seeing more stories with these Devil's Marauders.
It's an 80s film, isn't it? It's an 80s
definitely
action film. It's got elements of Predator in it.
There is,
Vietnam, sure. Predator, even mind blank. We'll skip on, otherwise having it's a science. It's very, very 80s, 90s action movie, and late 80s, early 90s action movie, and that makes sense.
Yeah, and you could have told more stories with these characters. You could have dropped them into any number of other worlds and seen how they dealt with those similarly bleak sort of battles and worlds and missions. I think that would have been very cool. I could imagine something like this making for quite a strong TV show as well. If you wanted to now make a 40k TV show, well, it's almost a sort of, you basically could tell a sort of high quality character-led drama about a squad of Imperial Guardsmen in these hellish worlds, and then sort of the internal relationships and the action and all that sort of stuff happening. So I think that there's a lot to this in just a handful of pages. It's quite short, it's only 24, 25 pages. And it does a really, really good job of creating a sense of place, of putting that world in the context of the 40k universe, and again showing us more aspects of how the Imperial Guard work, and how a sanctioned cycle works alongside them, and all of that sort of stuff. So again, it really does help flesh out the 40k universe, and this would still be, like some of the other stories, really relevant to 40k today. It's
Yeah,
quite a timeless quality to it.
absolutely. It fits in completely. I
Mm,
imagine you could do very little. You'd change maybe a few of the names, but other than
sure.
that, you would fit it.
Yeah. I mean, I was pleased as well because obviously we've read some really amazing William King fantasy stories,
Hmm.
and Deathwing was not of
Hmm.
that caliber, I don't think. So I was a bit worried that, maybe because I also don't think that the Dark Future story by William King was as strong as his fantasy work. And I just thought, well, maybe his sci-fi isn't as good. But this definitely corrected that
Yeah,
opinion for me
as
and
someone
said,
who's read
yeah,
his Space Wolf novels, they
right.
are excellent. I wasn't worried in that sense. That's why I felt that maybe there was. It might be completely unfair to Brian, but that's why I wondered whether the Bryan Ansell influence on that first story maybe disrupted what
Mm,
could have been a better flow
sure.
otherwise, because they are feel like they're written by completely different people, and in a sense
Yeah.
they are,
Well, and
because
because
it's
this one is super tight, it's a really good pace. It's like action in the right places, drama in the right places, world building throughout. Whereas, yeah, it's very patchy, that first story where you're getting
yeah,
all this stuff happening, but it's happening separately at different times and sort of a bit awkward. Um, but yeah, I liked this. It was a good read.
yeah, absolutely.
The Alien Beast Within by Ian Watson. The Imperial Calidus assassin Melindy has trained her body and mind to an unfathomable degree, and her skills and discipline are put to the ultimate test when she is ordered to undergo extreme surgery in order to infiltrate a Genestealer cult. Using the chameleonic drug polymorphine and her new surgical alterations, Melindy is able to get close to the leader of the cult, a deadly Genestealer patriarch. But when evidence of her presence is uncovered, she must adapt quickly if she is to complete her mission, let alone survive. The Alien Beast Within. This is the second of the Ian Watson stories in the collection, the final story in the collection. We're dealing with Genestealer cults again, but this time we're
Hmm.
taking a very different approach. We're not going in with terminators and all guns blazing. This is about a single assassin with a very specific mission.
Hmm.
How did you get on with this story?
I quite liked it. I think I preferred it to his first story, and as much as there were elements of the first one I liked, this felt more straightforward, um, for most parts. A couple of moments in it, but more straightforward for most parts. I really enjoyed the beginning. The kind of so so Melindy is a Calidus assassin, who has definitely a certain set of skills which she can morph into pretty much any humanoid form. And she's invited to a meeting where she is told what her next mission will be, and I quite like how challenging that is to her, because Calidus assassin are the utmost professional, cold, calm, nothing ever affects them. But you get to experience from her point of view how shocked she is with what she's told will happen.
Mm,
And the whole scene of being medically sort of dissected while she's awake, um, and not just the potential of pain, even though she's anesthetized, but also the procedure and what it will mean for her future. I mean, that she can no longer change to different forms again, other than the one of a hybrid Genestealer.
mm,
She's sort of grossed out by, sickened by, and that she's sort of the first of anyone that's ever had this done as well. Normally, I mean, apart from an Eldar, every other form she's changed into before has always been human. Um, and it sounded like she enjoyed the previous life she had. While she was an assassin, she could also change into people. Sometimes it was probably enjoyable. It was definitely a um, I mean, I don't know how they described it actually, but some of her work definitely involved honey trap, shall we say?
Yeah, it's like concubine missions,
Concubine
basically.
kind of mission, yeah. And I think she realizes that that will end now,
Mm,
even though she's portrayed as an attractive woman herself. But in order to, she's not going to be changing herself into another attractive woman in order to potentially kill someone in the future. So that whole fear of she's having this procedure, which is for life, that's is devastating to her. I wasn't really sure at the start whether how much she would change normally, but she can still change back to her normal form, which is a little bit hard to get your head around,
mm.
and based on the changes they make. Um, but I really liked all of that, and the polymorphine and that she has to take in order her to do that, and it's so she can go behind the lines of this city and look at the sort of the infestation of gene stealers in a city
Mm.
and explore it. And I really liked it, and I liked. I'm talking too much now. Just let you talk. But I really like the when we get towards the end and the way she kind of has to think about this changing into the psyche of the gene stealers was really interesting as well. I think there's lots of really strong, thought-provoking parts of the story.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, yeah. And um there was a because the way that they talk about, I mean, it's real like proper body horror, isn't it? When she's
Mm,
getting this procedure done, and the way they talk about the like she has implants put into her that can kind of, for want of a better word, sort of inflate when she takes the polymorphine and changes form. These implants will also activate and then give her an extra arm or a tail so that she
yeah,
can then blend in with the hybrids. And that's the reason she can never change into anything else, because now she's always going to have those. So yeah, all of that stuff is really interesting. And like you say, we're introduced to a very cold, calculating, sort of calm assassin, exactly like we've seen in all other 40k sort of fiction about the Calidus assassins. But here we do get to see an internal sort of monologue around feeling betrayed because she's been asked to take on a mission that sort of goes outside the parameters of what she would normally
yeah,
do, and costs is an extra sacrifice on top of all the other sacrifices she's already made. And there's, I mean, one of the things I thought was coolest in this story was like the training montage,
mm,
almost, or the training ground that you see early on,
yeah,
with like a huge caged wheel that they run on, and they run for hours and hours and hours, and there's an anti-grav person running on the top of the cage, so she's trying to run fast enough to catch the person who's at the top of the cage, the sort of wheel.
yeah,
So all of that kind of thing was really interesting, and just like the discipline and the sort of physical sacrifice. They talk about there'll be people who are training to smash plasteel piping or something like that, and if you break your leg, you continue training, because now you're not training to break the plasteel, you're training to suppress your own pain from the injury. So these kinds of things, like just how intense it is to be an assassin in this world.
yeah,
And yeah, there's loads of thought provoking stuff, isn't there? Just like around how she thinks about stuff and what she considers. I mean, you're right. The things where the reason she thinks she's such a good assassin who can infiltrate and camouflage herself is not just because of the polymorphine and the physical change, but because she can sympathize or sort of has empathy for her targets. And then
yes.
she has a very like a conflicted view later on when she has to have empathy for the patriarch of the Genestealer cults. It's
Yes.
quite an interesting sequence, isn't it?
So she realizes she's not going to be accepted unless she can empathize with him and think like him. She's being presented to a patriarch by a Magos in her form as a hybrid gene stealer. And so she's acting a part of someone that's, looking for sanctuary, somewhere to be. And she sort of lives up to it, but only by almost trying to understand the way they feel. And she does that almost by thinking how she feels hard done by Tarek Ziz, who's her superior, who's made her have this procedure. So her frustration and of what's happened to her and where her career, so to speak, as much as she's unhappy, she realizes she has no choice because she works for the emperor, she works for the Imperium, and there is only their will not hers. But she's some of that frustration, and she's able to kind of channel into the way that a Genestealer cult might think, and the reason they want to be separate and form their own societies and things. So she uses that to her advantage in order to be accepted. And it's really interesting to explore that through her thought process. It's pretty much all through her mind, isn't it? The whole story.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of her observations of how the Genestealer cult works and its hierarchy, and how they are using propaganda to encourage people to kind of associate. So you sort of see the Horus Heresy, but played out where the Emperor turns up and is the four-armed Emperor. And you're kind of, and the reason is to associate feelings of goodwill towards the Emperor to actually four-armed creatures like Genestealers. So there's this kind of
subliminal
sort of
messaging through the play, and it's clever.
Yeah, and that's all great. That's really, really cool. It just speaks to the insidious nature, because this is an imperial world with a sort of temple city, and it's underneath the temple that the Genestealer cult is active. And I think I prefer this representation of Genestealer cults to what we saw in Deathwing, where they've taken over and now they're just sort of running an industrial city, I guess, to build a spaceship or something. But in this case, they're still trying to take over. They haven't won yet. And I think it's more interesting just seeing them like underneath the surface.
Yeah, I think both those examples would exist in my mind, or my understanding of it, but this is a more enjoyable way to read it, and more what you think most of the time at the beginnings of an infestation.
I guess I'm just not that interested. It's almost like the dog that's caught up with the car it's chasing in Deathwing. So the Genestealers have won. They've defeated everyone. They've taken over a world. What do they then do? They just like create a factory and just work in a factory. And that's, I don't know, that doesn't feel like the sort of climactic next step for having taken over a planet. Whereas, because we've not quite gotten to the place, although we haven't gotten to the place yet where you really do get the direct relationship with Tyranids from the Genestealer cults, as in they just like prepare the groundwork and then get destroyed by the Tyranids themselves.
Had the connection been made at this point?
So it would have been the same year when Advanced Space Crusade came out, which was more explicit in it. Yeah. And it may have been mentioned elsewhere, but I think that's one of the first major mentions of that relationship. It is alluded to in this story, though, because Melindy kind of considers maybe there's a sort of a puppet master pulling the strings for the genes. She never says Tyranids, but she says maybe there's something worse that's directing their efforts. And I thought that was really cool, because that's just, it invokes this greater threat, and we now know what that is. At the time, you might not have, and it's quite cool. And that's not present in Deathwing at all, I don't think.
No, and I imagine at the time of writing, he wouldn't have known, and the source material available to him, and for all of the bits that I alluded to in the previous story, there's little elements of that here as well that maybe again aren't necessarily needed for the story. But aside from that, if you remove that, and I'm going to make a comparison with Brian Craig, because those elements they're very much the same. They feel a little bit surprising that they're in the stories. Ian Watson definitely gets 40k universe in the way that Brian Craig doesn't get Warhammer. It feels like he's writing in a different world, whereas it's essentially 40k. It absolutely feels like 40k that it could exist today in modern writing as well. He's nailed it very well. So in that sense, it's perfect. And I really enjoyed this one.
Yeah, you can see why he was the author who was sort of tapped to write the full novels, because as I mentioned, I would have loved to have seen more Storm Constantine writing in 40k, and I think that would have been an ace novel to read. But of all of the other writers in this collection, Watson's probably pulling together some of the most interesting sort of very 40k ideas and explorations and things that will go on to inform. You mentioned before his Inquisitor story that we've just read earlier could easily have taken place. It could have been a Dan Abnett sort of style story and probably influenced Abnett. We know Abnett dedicated one of his books in the Horus Heresy, one of his sort of finale books, to Ian Watson. So there's clearly a direct line from what Watson's doing with these kinds of stories to later 40K fiction. And yeah, I think this particular story, there are some things that didn't work as well for me. I can live with them. I mean, certainly you get like oddness around, like, so some of the physical stuff that's talked about. I mean, Watson likes to talk about like the flaps that the hybrids have on a certain part of their anatomy when they go to the bathroom, and that seems just, you know, like an unnecessary detail. But then you also get like a really interesting kind of odd. It's inconceivable how he came to have this thought, but it's fantastic in context of the world, where Melindy, having been genetically modified to become a Genestealer hybrid, but she's not actually a Genestealer hybrid. So she's eaten a load of food, she's gone to the bathroom, and then she sort of thinks, oh, I wonder if my stool would give me away. Like, is that human stool or is that hybrid stool based on my like physiognomy now?
And, I mean, it's interesting, but who's it interesting to? Is this another meme? Is this that meme where the bloke's turning away in bed thinking, and the woman is thinking, I bet he's thinking of another woman, and he's thinking, if I was a Genestealer, would my poo still be like human poo or like Genestealer poo?
It's an incredible thought process.
It's amazing and also very strange all at the same time.
It absolutely is, because that's totally unnecessary, but it also totally makes sense for Melindy in that moment to think that thing. It does add to the world. It does build on it. We don't need it, and we would have been fine without it. But it feels already. This feels so like this has informed my understanding of what an Ian Watson story is, because there's so many of those kind of things. Ride. Yes, I think I'm very excited about Inquisitor, because I think there's going to be this sort of excess of detail. And yeah, again, his sort of word choice of this kind of lurid kind of style of writing to really take advantage of all of these strange nooks and crannies of the world. You can feel it. You can feel it for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. My only issue, if I had an issue with with any of the character stuff, I suppose, it would be that Melindy's probably her escape plan is not particularly good. So she's kind of left a setup in her hotel room that's going to like automatically inject her so she could turn back into a human. But she had no suspicions that the very shady hotel owner might actually be in league with the Genestealer cults. So he finds all her stuff and then comes down into the cult and reveals that there's an infiltrator. And then she has to sort of adapt and move quickly. Now, it was a bit rubbish that she was so easily wrong-footed by the hotel guy, but I did like her sort of adaptation to the situation. So she was going to use micro bombs or something like that to try and kill the patriarch. Instead, she uses the polymorphine drug that's allowed her to change her shape. And this was quite cool, I thought, because it was introduced early on as being something that almost liquefies the organs and the bones and the body and requires a real discipline and understanding in order to reshape yourself into a new form.
Yeah, it's by the mind.
Right, exactly. And knowing that, she injects the patriarch through the eye, because that's the only part where he doesn't have the sort of carapace and the armor. And then his body starts to turn into this sort of, liquidize itself. And the patriarch is desperately trying to will himself not to lose his form, but he doesn't know how. He doesn't have the discipline. So he just sort of is liquefied. It's grotesque, but it's so perfect in this story. It works with everything that's introduced. It's Chekhov's polymorphine gun. It's a great execution of like this thing that's introduced for one reason, used for another reason that makes sense. So
Hmm.
I thought all of that was great.
Yeah, it was really good. It was really, really good. And I'm kind of with you on the hotel thing. I mean, it's a minor part,
Yeah.
but you'd expect her because she's got everything else so nailed down. The only thing that she doesn't have control over anymore is how many things she can morph into because that's been taken away from her. Um, but I do like that the hotel owner stole her little needle pistol
Mm.
thing, and he thinks he's got her at the end. By pointing at her, and she just kills him because she's an assassin. Just
Yeah.
a few minutes afterwards, a few clicks when he's not looking, sort of thing. So I like that. You kind of for a moment you think, oh, jeopardy, but then he's like, no, she's a Calidus assassin. He's toast, and he was. But yeah, I really like that sort of the polymorphing twist. Well, it
Mm.
wasn't really a twist, but the way that the patriarch died, it was very, very good.
Yeah.
Yeah, really good story.
It was good. Yeah, it was really good. And I think it definitely it explores an idea that I would never have imagined otherwise. What if somebody was infiltrating a Genestealer cult? How would you do it?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's a fascinating idea, and it's well executed as a story. There is tension, there is drama. You're sort of on the mission with her. It's again kind of cinematic in its setup
Mm,
and how it's sort of delivered. Interesting that Melindy survives because you also get this sense because she has to empathize and sort of get really into the mindset of a Genestealer cult member, and because she's leaning on how she feels betrayed by the leadership of the Calidus
yeah.
Temple, because what she's had to sacrifice. It raises the specter of maybe she's going to actually fully commit to, maybe the story will be that she doesn't leave, she becomes a Genestealer for real.
Yeah, I did think that a few points.
Yeah,
So that's good that you've had the same thoughts.
yeah,
Yeah, you did it, and that's that kind of that feeling of unhappiness and betrayal that her path has been taken from her and been changed.
yeah.
Um, yeah, it was good.
Yeah, it is good. But yeah, Melindy does survive. So we know Melindy, it even says on the back of the book that Melindy the assassin and Grim the squat will be returning in Inquisitor. I'm excited to see like how that works. Does she have the surgery reversed? Is she getting new polymorphine? Is she just turning into Genestealer hybrids all over the place? Like what that looks like? It's also interesting because Melindy obviously is the main character of this story, and we get loads of her perspective, her skill. Grim the Squat just sort of happens to be in the other story. He doesn't really do very much at all. He's cool,
It's the
but he's
same with the
not
squats all the way through this book, though.
sure. Yeah,
They
they're just
turn
there.
up, they
Yeah,
have short names, and they say a couple of things, point out something obvious, and they kind of tick. It's almost ticking like the Ogrins that have appeared.
hmm.
Again, it's that game element, isn't it? It's like look at these interesting humans that are within the Imperium. So we've got the soldiers, we've got the Marines. Who else do we see? Assassins. Well, we've got those covered. Well, we've got to stick in the fun squat and the fun Ogrin because people love them, aren't they? Funny, and they are there as sort of token little gesture things, aren't they?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the Squats fare a little bit better than the Ogrins, I think, but you're
A little
right.
bit, but
Definitely.
I still think that goes back to if you were a 14 to 18-year-old and you had to collect yourself a group of 8 heroes or something like that, you'd have your Space Marine, a couple of guard, a commissar, maybe an assassin, but you'd add a squat and you'd add an Ogryn in because they're cool
Yeah,
models and it feels like that's what these are representing in these stories because the stories wouldn't change without them if they were just other human characters.
yeah. But yeah, I mean, it does work. It adds texture to the world and the
Mm.
universe, I
Yeah, and
think.
that's what I think it's there for. So
Yeah,
that makes the world even more recognizable to
yeah.
the readers from the game books they know and are familiar with.
I am looking forward to seeing more of Grim and like more of his
Yeah,
character.
I'm hope there's something good made of him.
Yeah, yeah, for
The
sure.
name's not great, so
I,
let's hope.
I'd actually quite like to see a little bit more of the Inquisitor Cipilian
Mm.
from that story. And I don't know if he does return. I'm guessing not, but I think it would be cool because he was like I like that character for some reason. I don't know why,
Yeah,
but
yeah. It would have been interesting to explore some more.
yeah, definitely interested, intrigued on what we're going to see more. But Alien Beast Within, I thought was a strong story. I thought it was a really good end to this collection. I
Yeah,
mean, what do you think overall? What was your favorite of the tales in the book?
this might be my favorite
Right.
actually. I really did like Warp Stars as well for different reasons, but I think this might be my favorite.
Yeah.
But overall, there's only one I didn't really like. And as a compilation, and that's pretty strong
Mm,
if you compare it with some of the others. It definitely feels a lot more 40k than some of the Warhammer compilations felt Warhammer.
mm,
Um, and very much, of course, of its era, but also still relevant with modern 40k as well. And I really enjoyed it, and it was. I think I went into it very open minded anyway. And just excited to read the first 40k fiction of that era because it's definitely nothing I'd read before. At least I may have read the Deathwing story from I had the supplement. I'm sure I must have read it, but I don't remember reading it.
mm.
But it was nice reading stories in a novel form outside of short stories in White Dwarfs and things. So yeah, I really enjoyed the book. It was very good.
Yeah. Yeah. Me too. Me too. I think it's for me. Lacrimata was my favorite of this collection, but I think there were some really strong stories in here. I enjoyed it as a complete anthology, and even the sort of weaker stories were not terrible in the way that some.
Yeah,
I
Lacrimata
mean,
was mine. I said sort of Warp Stars, but Lacrimata was my favorite.
right. Yeah, I mean, I think some of the Warhammer short stories have been a bit more challenging, let's say, um,
Mm.
and not none of these were as challenging. And for the first 40k anthology, it's really strong as a collection of like explorations of this world. There's enough diversity in the nature of the stories, the worlds, the characters. I mean, arguably the only thing that's kind of underrepresented in this collection is Space Marines compared to how
Yeah,
important they're going to be in the fiction going forward. You get Deathwing with loads of Space Marine Terminators in, but even then they don't act very modern Space Marine-y.
yeah. You
And
get
other
them
than that,
mentioned
they're
in Warp
barely in it.
Stars, I think. We think
Here
because
and
the way they're
there,
talk of is very
yeah.
much, and maybe this is the difference between Space Marines at the time. I also obviously watched your recent interview with Ian Watson, and he talks about the Space Marines a bit. You just get that feeling that they are yes, they're engineered, but they're also less 8 foot tall post-humans and more of a connection to their previous manhood, being
Mhm.
a human race of man, rather than something that the modern day Space Marine barely resembles what they were before. They're humanoid, but they're not. They don't really feel like men anymore, and that's explored quite well again in the Horus Heresy about how 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 can relate to the people that
Mm.
they're supposedly protecting. Because that's what the idea of the Space Marines is protect humanity.
Yeah,
And that's a question about whether they're actually protecting humanity or not. But they definitely feel closer to humanity in the way they're portrayed here, much more super soldier army rather than this what they all grow into. So that maybe that's part of that.
yeah, I think you're right, and I think because I still, as I said before, I think that this is a world, this 40k version of the world. Uh, it's one where you could imagine Space Marines going off shift and going for a beer,
Yeah,
in
yeah,
the sort of cantina, which is, that won't exist for much longer.
no, yeah, they'd have recreation time, but it's probably training.
Probably praying
That's it.
somewhere, right?
Praying.
Yeah.
Yeah, it depends on the chapter or legion. If you go back to heresy stuff, and there's a
Mm.
little bit more of it's not really recreation as such.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, overall, really good stuff. I mean, what is this a thumbs up or a thumbs down
Oh,
for you?
absolutely, absolutely. Thumbs up for the book. Really,
Yeah, me
really
too.
enjoyed it.
Yeah, really good stuff. Um, Next time we're going to be talking about Ian Watson's first novel. So it is going to be
Mm.
Inquisitor, and we're going to be getting into all of the, I'm sure, weird and wonderful corners of the
Yes.
40k universe with this one.
It's going to be interesting.
First part of a trilogy, and yeah, some new characters, some old characters who we've just met. It's supposed to be an interesting one.
Yeah, it's iconic, isn't it? It's not been read before, so I'm excited just from that point of view, and having now experienced Ian Watson for your interview, watching it, and then the 2 short stories. I've got all kinds of expectations for some things that will be strange, but also some really good storytelling. I imagine now someone that gets the 40k universe, because that last story said to me that he definitely gets it.
Yeah, same. Very excited for this. Can't wait to see where it goes. But that'll be our next book club for next month. In the meantime, Stu, where can people find you online?
Miniature Realms, YouTube primarily, but then all the social media under the same name that generally support and feed into the YouTube these days.
Great stuff. Yeah, and I'll put links to your channel and your social media, your Patreon, all down below. You'll also be able to find links to my social media and Patreon down in the description too. But until next month, thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.